everyone, and welcome to Toronto Apologetics. My name is Tony Costa, and I'm going to be discussing, this is one in a series of videos where I'm going to be discussing the subject of Christmas. There's a lot of questions about Christmas. Is Christmas pagan? Was Jesus really born on December 25th? And the whole issue with Christmas trees and the holly and the ivy and all these types of things we usually hear as we enter into the Christmas season, that these are things that come out of paganism, that Christians should really not observe them. So we'll be discussing some of those in the next couple of weeks as we enter into the Advent season, starting this coming Sunday. One of the things that we often hear is around this time when people say Merry Xmas instead of Merry Christmas. A lot of Christians think that this is an attempt to degrade Jesus Christ, and it's an attempt to remove his name. And you'll hear people say, put Christ in Christmas, and Jesus is the reason for the season. And while I would agree with that, there is a lot of misunderstanding in this particular area. In fact, there's nothing wrong with saying Merry Xmas. That's not really should not be an insult to Christians if we have a proper understanding of the history of Christianity. One of the things I wanted to share with you is the fact that if we look into the history of this type of language, and I want us to consider today Xmas versus Christmas, I hope that after I'm done here today, you will come to appreciate the fact that even if people do have an intention to try to remove the word Christ out of Christmas, God does have a great sense of humor, in the sense that the capital letter X actually stood for the name Christ in ancient Christianity. And so when we consider what is called the Christ monogram in the ancient church, this was a symbol for the name Christ. And it's composed actually of two Greek letters. The X there in the center is known as the chi, and the what looks like the letter P is actually the rho. It's the R sound in Greek. And so this monogram stands for Christos, which is the Greek word for Christ. And so when early Christians saw this, they knew that it meant Christ. It was a reference to Christ. And we also know that at a very early period, people would start using that monogram, sometimes called the chi rho, and there you'll notice the X again in the center, and you'll see the P there. And in this particular depiction, you'll see the word Christos again for Christ. You also notice on both the left and the right side, you've got these weird-looking symbols. Well, that's actually the alpha and the omega. That's actually the first letter of the Greek alphabet, the alpha. The last letter of the Greek alphabet is the omega. And so the first letter alpha, you should know that from the English word alphabet. This refers to Jesus Christ as the beginning and the end, the first and the last, the alpha and the omega, the A and the Z. And if you're Canadian or part of the Commonwealth, the A and the Z. And so here you have this depiction. This was very common in Christian burial plots. It was very common in finding this in Christian sarcophagi, or the sarcophagus, another name for a tomb where Christians would be placed in. And so as you can see, the X there, the chi, where we get the CH sound, was an ancient representation for Christ. It was something like an abbreviation. And if we look at one of the manuscripts that we have, this is from the Gospel of Mark. This is actually the beginning of the Gospel of Mark. And I want you to notice that it begins by saying the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, if you look at the second line from the top, you don't have to know Greek to know what I'm going to tell you now. If you look on the second line from the top, that is where you have what looks like a letter A on the far left. If you look in the second line, you'll notice there's this straight line written over a number of letters. And what you see there, those lines on top of those letters, this indicates what's known as a nomina sacrum, or in the plural, nomina sacra, which means sacred names. And what that means is that whenever they would refer to Jesus, they wouldn't spell out his name in full, like the name Jesus, and they wouldn't spell out the name Christ in full. So what you have here is the line, the first line is over what looks like an I and a Y. That's the word, that's the name Yesu, that is Jesus. And then if you notice on the second line, you'll notice there's a line over what looks like an X and a Y, which is Christou, which is Jesus Christ. That is the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so you'll notice that when early Christians would read this in the Greek language, and they saw the capital X, and they saw a line over it connecting it to another letter, they automatically knew that this was a reference to Christ. This is how they would say Christ. They would use these abbreviations, or what's called, again, nomina sacra. So as you can see, this idea of using these abbreviations is nothing new. It's been around for a very long time. And so the irony here is that when people, if they do have malicious intent in trying to remove Christ out of the word Xmas, what they don't realize is that to the ancient Christians, the X was actually the abbreviation for Christ. And so whether you have Christmas or Xmas, at the end of the day, Xmas is just short for Christ. And so I hope that this video has been helpful to you. As I said, there will be more videos forthcoming. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Toronto Apologetics. My name is Tony Costa. Today, I'm going to be continuing our series on Christmas, answering questions about Christmas. One of the things we usually hear is that the word Christmas is not a biblical term or a biblical word, and that Christians really should not use it. And they would also say that the word Christmas comes from the word Christ Mass, and they will claim that the Mass is a Roman Catholic thing, and that Bible-believing Christians should not be associated with the Mass. And so just as we have seen in our other topics and our other videos, there's a lot of confusion on these terms. And therefore, what I want to do is I want to clear this up by looking at some of the evidence that we have in the word Christmas and where this word comes from. Let me begin by first saying that just because a word is not found in the Bible, it does not mean that the idea or the doctrine is not in there. And so when people start using words like, well, Christmas is not in the Bible, well, neither is the word Trinity, neither is the word millennium, neither is the word second coming of Christ, neither is the word rapture, and so forth and so on. And so we need to be very careful here. So we want to look at the background of this word Christmas, and we want to clear away some of the fog that usually tends to get in the way of understanding the background to some of these words. So is the word Christmas biblical? Well, the word Christmas, the root of the word Christmas comes from actually two words, Christ and Mass. And so Christmas is basically a merging together of these two separate words into one word. So Christmas becomes like a compound word containing the words Christ and Mass. Now, we all know who Christ is, obviously. It's Jesus. And the next part is the Mass. Well, what does the word Mass mean? A lot of folks confuse that with, as I said, the ritual in the Roman Catholic Church, where the Roman Catholic priest performs what's called the Eucharistic sacrifice, where he takes the bread and the cup and believes in what's called transubstantiation. That is not what the word Mass means. There are Lutherans today that will call their gatherings, their Sunday morning gatherings, the Mass. And so it's not particularly a word that's only used in Roman Catholic circles. It's also used in Protestant circles as well. So we know what Christ means, but we want to investigate the word Mass. Where does the word Mass come from? Well, the word Mass comes from a Latin word, the Vulgar Latin, which would be the common Latin that the common people would speak. It comes from the word messa. And then later that word messa in late Latin was missa. And the word missa literally means dismissal. it has to do with dismissing. It has nothing to do with a certain ritual or a certain ceremony that is performed in a house of worship. It comes from a word that means dismissal. You will notice that even in the word dismissal, you have the word misa in there. The word dismiss contains the word miss, which comes from misa. And you will notice that that word also appears in words like missions, and someone being a missionary all derives from this Latin word, which has the idea of sending. If you pay a bill at the bank or you receive a bill that is to be paid, they will say something like make remittance to. And what is remittance? Well, remittance means to send again, to send payment for a certain bill. And so the idea then of this word mass, from messa and then misa, has to do with sending out or a dismissal. So what does this have to do with celebrating the birth of Christ? What does this have to do with a sending out? Well, we need to understand that the word mass, as it has come to us from the Latin word, was a word that was used in the Western Church when the church service came to an end. The pastor would say the following words in Latin: ite missa est, meaning go, it is the dismissal. And this would usually come after the benediction, when a word of prayer or blessing was made by the pastor on the congregation. And then they would say, go now, let us go forth from this place to love God and love our neighbor. Go, it is the dismissal. In other words, it means church is dismissed. And we usually hear this at the end of certain occasions where you come to the end of a program and they will say things like, you are dismissed. And you hear this in courts of law where a judge dismisses a case, the case dismissed, meaning the case is sent away. It's concluded. And so the word mass then came to refer to the church service, to the service of the people of God. And it would refer to this idea of going forth, going at the end of the service, being dismissed out into the world to be advocates and ambassadors for Jesus Christ. And so that is where we get the word misa from, and the word mass. It has to do with the dismissal. And so the Christ Mass has to do with the Christian service to Christ, that is, the Christian service in honor of Christ, in which the people of God would gather. And of course, at the end of the service, they would be dismissed. And so, folks, this is really the background to the word Christmas. And as you can see, that word has nothing to do with the Roman Catholic Church in particular, although they use that language as well for their service. But then again, so do Lutherans. And so this is part of the problem when we don't understand the root and the history of given words that we use today. And so when you go to a Christmas service at your local church, whether it's Christmas Eve or Christmas Day, what are you doing? You're going to the service where you are celebrating Christ. And in this particular case, the birth of Christ, after which you will be dismissed. So hopefully. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Toronto Apologetics. My name is Tony Costa, and today I will be continuing answering questions about Christmas. Today, we're going to be discussing what is probably the most commercial, probably the most well-known icon and figure that most people in the secular world think of when they think of Christmas, and that is, of course, Santa Claus. And so I want to talk today about the figure that we know as Santa Claus and where that figure came from and why that figure has become such a part of Western commercialization during Christmas time. And so we want to take a look at the history of Santa Claus and how he came about. Now, in order to understand the idea of Santa Claus, we need to go way, way back to the 4th century, and we need to consider this important figure in church history by the name of Saint Nicholas. St. Nicholas was the bishop of Myra, which was a city in Asia Minor, which is modern day Turkey. And he was born approximately AD 270, and he died in AD 343. The date of his death is believed to have been December the 6th, AD 343, and that is why today in the Christian calendar, you will notice that December 6th is a day that is generally dedicated to St. Nicholas. It is his feast day, and usually this would be marked by the day of their death. And so when a Christian was martyred or they had died, that death date usually would be recorded as the date to remember them by. And so that day would be associated with that person. And so in the case of Nicholas, because he had died on December 6th, 343, December 6th has been known throughout Christian history, at least in the Christian calendar as we know it, as St. Nicholas's Day, or the day dedicated to St. Nicholas. So we begin with Nicholas, and you will see how the Santa Claus figure evolved out of this, how this Santa Claus figure developed from this 4th century Christian leader. There's also a story that we're not exactly sure about, but some historians will say that it's possible that Nicholas may have been present at the First Ecumenical Council in AD 325, which was the Council of Nicaea, a very important council, considered again the First Ecumenical Council. And there's a story that some believe may be legendary, that Nicholas walked across the aisle and slapped Arius of Alexandria in the face. And the idea there being that Arius was the grand heretic who denied the full deity of Christ and taught that the Son of God had a beginning, that there was a time, he said, when he was not, when the Son did not exist. And therefore the church condemned that view, called today Arianism, as a heresy. And so if that's the case, then of course, Nicholas was a defender of orthodoxy. Now, what's his connection with what later would become Santa Claus? We know that Nicholas he came from a wealthy family. His father and mother both were wealthy. And we know that he had a very generous spirit in the terms of giving gifts and valuable items to people who were poor, particularly the poor. And there is a story of Nicholas granting or giving to a pious Christian man who had 3 daughters. Because of his poverty, the girls were in danger of being sent out into prostitution. And so Nicholas gave dowries actually to the father, dowries so that they could be married off to people who could provide for them and so forth. And in other words, he saved these 3 girls from poverty and from going into prostitution. Now, we need to understand that the person of Santa Claus is actually a composite figure. What do I mean by this? He begins to develop. So this tradition of St. Nicholas being a giver of gifts and showing charity and love to the poor and so forth made its way into Western Europe, into Holland, for example. And in Holland, St. Nicholas was called Sinterklaas. Sinterklaas. And Sinterklaas is the Dutch name for this figure. You could see the roots here of St. Nicholas. You notice the bishop's mitre, his hat, for example, the bishop's hat. You will also notice the bishop's staff that he carries and so forth. And so in Holland, the idea was that this figure who was connected to St. Nicholas and was called Sinterklaas is a figure who would give gifts to children. It's this figure where you begin to see him coming down chimneys and so forth, and putting little gifts in the little wooden clogs of the children, of course, wooden clogs being very common in Holland. And so this was very widespread in the country of Holland. And when the Dutch began to move across the Atlantic, for example, in the early 17th century, in the early 1600s, the Dutch settled in the southern tip of Manhattan in New York and founded that area as New Amsterdam. So the Dutch had colonized there in the southern tip of Manhattan and not only called it New Amsterdam, but remained there. They were basically the center of the colonial center of the Dutch government. Now, in 1664, when the English had come to the Americas, the English took over New Amsterdam and they renamed it, and you guessed it, they named it New York. And that is the name of not only the city there today, but it's also become the name of the entire state of New York. And it was called New York after the Duke of York. And so you could see first the Dutch influence in New Amsterdam. And then, of course, you see the English influence coming later in renaming that area New York, which it still bears that name to this day. And so why do I say this? Well, because the figure of Sinterklaas came across into North America through the Dutch, through the Dutch colonials. So when the Dutch were colonizing the Americas, they brought these traditions with them. So they would have Sinterklaas and the idea of giving gifts to children and the idea of coming down the chimneys and so forth. Well, this idea of Sinterklaas, when the English came, of course, the English also had their traditions of St. Nicholas as well. And it's here that we begin to see the development of Old St. Nick. And it's with Old St. Nick that we begin to see the figure of the modern day commercialized Santa Claus. And so he's known by various names. Old St. Nick, he's also known as Kris Kringle and Father Christmas as well, or in French, Père Noël. And you can see how all of this begins to develop. So notice the connection to Nicholas is still there. You see the word Old Saint Nick, Nick being short for Nicholas. And of course, if you look at the word Santa Claus, the word Santa means saint, and Claus is short for Nicholas. And so the term Claus is the ending of the word Nicholas. You see this as well in the Dutch with the word Klaas at the end, Sinterklaas, Saint Claus, Saint Nicholas. And so with the rise of Santa Claus as Old Saint Nick and how he becomes associated with gift giving and so forth, you begin to see the commercialization of Santa Claus, particularly in America. And you will also notice that it is also the company Coca-Cola that later adopted that figure of Santa Claus. They weren't the ones who created that figure, but they did adopt him, and they used Santa Claus as a major proponent for advertising for Coca-Cola. And it's also not surprising that the colors of Coca-Cola are red and white, just like Santa Claus's costume is red and white. And so unfortunately, Santa Claus, who is a dim shadow of the ancient St. Nicholas, who evolved and developed and became a composite figure, became associated with the commercialism that we find in the West today. And so, as you can see, the figure of Santa Claus today, when you think of Santa Claus, you think of gifts, you think of children sitting on his lap at the shopping malls, and you think of children looking forward to Christmas Eve or Christmas Day when Santa Claus would come and give his gifts to the children. And again, that tradition, as I said, also comes from Holland, the practice of Christmas in Holland with Sinterklaas. Now, here's the point. a lot of parents struggle, particularly Christian parents struggle with the idea of, do we tell our children that Santa Claus is real or not real? And here we need to be very careful, because to teach children that there is this man who lives up in the North Pole, and he lives there with a band of elves, and these elves are busy throughout the year making all these gifts so Santa Claus can go out with flying reindeer, mind you, with magical reindeer where he can fly up through the sky and so forth, and go around the world and dropping gifts and so forth and so on, going through chimneys. Again, that comes from Holland. We need to be very careful here, because what we don't want to do is we don't want to detract from the center of Christmas, which is the birth of Jesus Christ. We do not want to decentralize Jesus Christ. We want to centralize Jesus Christ. He is the reason for the season, and he's the center of all things. Now, what do we do with Santa Claus? Well, I think with Santa Claus, it's important to teach our children, not to mislead them into thinking that this figure really lives, and he lives forever. You know, he's immortal. He doesn't die. He lives in the North Pole, and he's immortal. He doesn't age and die like everyone else. We need to be careful here, because let's face it, at the end of the day, you are misleading your children into believing something that's not true. And for Christians, truth is a central aspect of our faith. We follow the one who claimed to be the truth. And therefore, to make children believe something, remember, children are very impressionable, but children also know the difference between for real and pretend. They know the difference between pretending and something that is real. And so what I have advised parents is that you should never take Christ away from the center during the Christmas season. And secondly, you want to tell them that the figure of Santa Claus is a figure that is pretending. That is to say, a figure that is based on a real Christian in history, a faithful Christian who cared about the poor, who gave to those who did not have. And so the idea of giving at Christmas, the idea of giving to those who are less fortunate, has its roots in Christianity. Not Santa Claus, but in the historical Nicholas, the historical St. Nicholas, Bishop of Myra. And so I think it's important that we keep that balance very carefully held, that we need to let our children know that Jesus is the reason for the season, and tell them that Santa Claus is one of those, is part of the world of pretend, and that he is actually a figure that is based on a real historical figure in history that was a faithful servant of Jesus Christ. And so it doesn't help to make our children think that Santa Claus is a real existing figure. People say, well, they're just children, but children, again, children believe their parents before anyone else. And therefore, it's important for us to be truthful. It's no different than telling children about the tooth fairy, that if you lose your teeth and you place your tooth under a pillow, the tooth fairy is going to come and put money there and take your tooth. And no one ever asked the question how the tooth fairy became so wealthy. I mean, who is she selling these teeth to? But all kidding aside, I think it's important to realize Santa Claus was deliberately created. The old Saint Nick was deliberately created as a commercial prop. We saw that with the Coca-Cola company. And today, let's face it, today, these big businesses out there, retail stores, their hottest time of the year is Christmas. And they're not doing it because of Jesus Christ. They're doing it for the almighty dollar. And so the message of Christmas is the very opposite of that. It's not about accumulating wealth to yourself, but giving of yourself to others, being selfless, not selfish, being like Christ, who emptied himself and became a servant, became a slave, so that he could give us, so that, as the Bible says, he who was rich rather, became poor, so that we, through his poverty, might become rich to God. And therefore, we need to keep these things in balance, and we need to let our children know where Santa Claus comes from, and we also need to make them aware that this is simply a figure that is pretend based on this ancient Christian. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Toronto Apologetics. My name is Tony Costa. Today, we're going to be continuing our series on questions about Christmas. And in this session, we're going to be looking at the Christmas tree and whether or not the Christmas tree is pagan. So let's jump right into it and let's tackle this question. Is the Christmas tree pagan? Of course, every Christmas we are familiar with this tree, the decorations on the tree, the lights on the tree, and so forth. So the question is the Christmas tree really pagan? Now, you are probably told by others that, yes, the Christmas tree is pagan. We shouldn't have Christmas trees in our homes. We shouldn't have them in our church buildings and so on and so forth, and that these are violations of Scripture. And unfortunately, when we hear things over and over and over again without questioning them or testing them, what we find is that these traditions become almost gospel, these ideas that we keep hearing over and over again. And I admit that as a young Christian believer, I used to parrot the same mantras. I used to assume the same thing until I was challenged, until I started looking deeper into the subject, doing research and reading what other historians and scholars had to say on the origins of such ideas and stories. And unfortunately, there tends to be a lot of urban myths that start floating around in the church. Well, let me just say from the beginning that the Christmas tree actually comes from the 16th century. It comes from the 1500s, and it was actually popularized by no less an authority than one of the reformers. We're going to come back to that in a minute. But before doing so, I want us to look at a couple of passages of Scripture. In fact, we were going to look at Jeremiah 10, verses 1 to 5, and these are the passages that are routinely quoted to argue that the Christmas tree is pagan. And so you may have heard this passage from Jeremiah. I'm going to read first from the King James Version, and then we're going to look at the same passage in the ESV, the English Standard Version. And so here in Jeremiah 10, 1 to 5, in the King James Version, hear ye the word which the Lord speaketh unto you, O house of Israel. Thus saith the Lord, learn not the way of the heathen, and be not dismayed at the signs of heaven, for the heathen are dismayed at them. For the customs of the people are vain. For one cutteth a tree out of the forest, the work of the hands of the workmen, with the axe. They deck it with silver and with gold. They fasten it with nails and with hammers, that it move not. They are upright as the palm tree, but speak not. They must needs be born, because they cannot go. Be not afraid of them, for they cannot do evil, neither also is it in them to do good. And so traditionally we heard this passage read, and in particular, they will point out to the verse that says that the customs of the people are vain. Someone cuts a tree out of the forest, and they deck it with silver and with gold. Well, there you have it. What else could that be? That must be the Christmas tree. Someone goes out, cuts a tree in the forest, brings it home, decks it with silver and with gold, and then they fasten it with nails and so forth and so on. So there you have it. That's the Christmas tree. But not so fast. Let's consider the context of this passage and also recognize that the prophet Jeremiah is prophesying during the 6th century BC. And the question, of course, is, were Christmas trees used in the 6th century BC, or were any of these trees used as objects of worship? Let's look at the same passage, but this time we want to look at it in the ESV, the English Standard Version, see what it says. Hear the word that the Lord speaks to you, O house of Israel. Thus says the Lord, learn not the way of the nations, nor be dismayed at the signs of the heavens, because the nations are dismayed at them. For the customs of the peoples are vanity. A tree from the forest is cut down and worked with an axe by the hands of a craftsman. They decorate it with silver and gold. They fasten it with hammer and nail so that it cannot move. Now, this is very important. Their idols are like scarecrows in a cucumber field, and they cannot speak. They have to be carried, for they cannot walk. Do not be afraid of them. Notice the them, for they cannot do evil, neither is it in them to do good. So the prophet Jeremiah is prophesying. God is speaking through Jeremiah to the people of Israel, to the house of Israel. He warns them not to learn the way of the nations or the peoples or the Gentiles, and not to be dismayed at the heavenly signs. There's a reference to astrology and the zodiac and so forth, because the nations follow after these astrologers, and they're dismayed at the signs of the heavens, much like people are today when they look at their horoscopes, or what I call horror scopes. And it talks about the vanity of the nations, these pagan nations, and it talks about how they go into the forest and they cut down a tree from the forest, and they notice it says they work it with an axe by the hands of craftsmen. Notice the craftsmen there. What do craftsmen do? Well, craftsmen create things. They craft things. They don't go and take trees and decorate trees. They take the trees, and out of the wood, that is out of the lumber from the tree, what do? They craft what? An idol. Notice that it's the hands of a craftsman, and craftsmen craft something. They're not crafting a tree. They're crafting idols from the wood of the tree. And what do they decorate? They decorate it with silver and gold. I don't think anyone today puts real gold and silver on trees. But what they mean here is they decorate the idol that they have formed from the wood of the tree. They plate it with silver and gold. You may have heard of things being gold plated, meaning it's not solid gold. They take a layer of gold, a leaf of gold, and what they'll do is they'll hammer it on to a certain item so that it's gold plated. And so these craftsmen who made idols would take silver and gold, and they would hammer it, or they would plate the idol, the wooden idol, with it. Remember, the Ark of the Covenant, although the Ark of the Covenant is not an idol, the Ark of the Covenant was made of wood and it was overlaid with gold. And so what you see here in this particular case is the craftsman creates an idol by taking the tree, creating out of its wood, crafting an idol, decking that idol with nails, rather silver and gold, and then fastening it with hammer nails, because idols aren't real. They can't stand. And notice it goes on to say they're idols. In the King James Version there, if you notice in the King James, it says at the bottom there, the fourth line from the bottom, they are upright as the palm tree. Well, who are they? What is the they? The they are the idols. They are upright. The idols are like scarecrows in a cucumber field. That is to say, they're dead idols. They cannot speak and they cannot walk. Just like Psalm 115 says, their idols have eyes, but they cannot see. They have ears, but cannot hear. They have feet, but cannot walk. And the Lord says, don't be afraid of them. Afraid of who? Don't be afraid of the idols, these so-called gods and so forth. Don't be afraid of them. They can't do anything. They're dead idols. They can't do evil and they can't do any good. So is Jeremiah talking about a Christmas tree? No, he's not talking about a Christmas tree. He's talking about the mere vanity of idols, that people have to actually create them out of trees. They have to take the wood. In other cases, they could take stone or metal. But in this particular case, the Lord is trying to show his people, do you understand how vain this is, that someone has to, they have to take down a tree and they have to hew out of its wood an idol and then plate it with gold and silver. So this is not talking about Christmas trees. This is talking about idols being crafted out of the wood of the tree that's been taken down. And so, as I said, the Christmas tree comes to us from the 16th century. And this reformer, Martin Luther, has a lot to do with our traditions. So the origin of the Christmas tree is from Germany. And Martin Luther, the reformer in particular, adopted the fir tree, the coniferous tree. And we know that Martin Luther not only brought in the tradition of using the Christmas tree, but he was one of the first to also place candles on the Christmas tree. And to Luther, the candles on the Christmas tree represented the stars that were out in the night that Christ was born. And so just as you look through a tree today, a fir tree, which is where the Christmas tree comes from, the type that we use for Christmas trees. If you look at a fir tree and you look through its needles, the branches, the needles, and you look up at the sky, you see these beautiful stars. And Luther tried to imitate that by placing candles on the Christmas tree. And so these lights, of course, represented Christ as the light of the world. And because the fir tree, the tree we use for Christmas trees, because they are hardy and they don't die during the winter, they remain during the winter. Their leaves don't die. Some of their needles might fall out, but overall, these trees survive through the winter, and so they were hardy. And so Luther saw this as a symbol of Christ's power, the invincibility of the power of the Lord Jesus Christ. And so it was actually the reformer, Martin Luther, that introduced the Christmas tree into Christianity. The other thing we need to bear in mind is that it entered into the English world through King George III. And it was also through his influence that this practice of using the Christmas tree entered into the Commonwealth nations, including the United States as well. The United States was once, the American colonies were part of Britain at one time. And it was under this king, by the way, that the colonies declared independence was against this king, King George III. And the royal family of England have links and they have bloodlines connected to the Germans. And so King George III brought this into usage in England, but it was made very popular by Queen Victoria and her husband, Prince Albert. It was with Queen Victoria that it was popularized. Remember, Prince Albert, the husband of Queen Victoria, was German. Her German husband, Prince Albert, brought that tradition of the Christmas tree into England as well. As I said, King George III introduced it, but it was popularized primarily by both Prince Albert and Queen Victoria. It's also from the Victorian age that the tradition of sending Christmas cards started. And so the giving and receiving of Christmas cards started under Queen Victoria, and it spread again into the Commonwealth and as well into the United States. Now, the other thing we need to also understand is that you hear a lot of folks say, well, the trees come from the German pagans and so forth and so on. But the only problem with that view is that to the pagan Germans, to the ancient Germans, the German pagans revered the oak tree, which is the tree on your left, because of its power, its might, because of its the strength of its roots and the trunk and so forth and so on. The fir tree on your right, which is customarily the Christmas tree in the West, the German pagans did not regard the fir tree as sacred. It wasn't a holy tree to them. They were tree worshipers. So they were actually the original, I call them the original tree huggers, but they worshiped the oak tree, the mighty oak tree, not the fir tree. The so-called Christmas tree was not worshiped by the pagans in Germany, but rather the mighty oak tree. Now, the oak tree was sacred to the Germans, the one on your left there, and it was so sacred that they believed that it was actually dedicated to the Norse god Thor. Thor in Norse mythology was the son of Odin, and he was also the god of thunder. And you've probably become more aware of him through the Marvel comics movies like the Avengers and Thor as well. So that mighty oak tree, there was a tree in Germany called the Oak of Geismar, and that tree was holy to Thor. It was dedicated to Thor. And there is an importance related to trees in the Bible. We don't have time in this video to go into it, but you'll notice in the Old Testament there's mentions of the Lord visiting Abraham while he was sitting by the oaks of Mamre and so forth. We don't have time to go into that. Maybe in a future video, I'll put something together on that. But in Germany, the Oak of Geismar was sacred to the Norse god Thor. But something interesting happened in AD 723. Boniface, who is referred to as the Apostle of Germany, who took the gospel to Germany and converted the pagans in Germany, what he did was he felled, or he chopped down, the great oak of Geismar. And here you see him there on your left. He is showing the German pagans that this tree is not a god, that this tree is not only a creation of the one true God, but because they revered this tree and they sacrificed animals in front of it. You'll see a ram there. It's behind the words Apostle of Germany. There's a ram there, a dead ram there on a stone altar that is being dedicated to this tree. Well, what Boniface did was, as a Christian, he wanted to show them that that this tree was not an idol. It was not supposed to be worshipped. It was not a god. And so in AD 723, Boniface, to demonstrate to them the defeat of paganism, he chopped down, he felled this mighty oak tree of Geismar. And according to this tradition, this oak tree, when it fell, it basically crushed every tree around it, with the exception of the fir tree, the tree that would later be called the Christmas tree. And so because he did this, he wanted to show the defeat of paganism, and he demonstrated that the Germans had nothing to fear from this. And because it was a central place of worship for the pagan Germans, Boniface destroyed this idol. And as I said, it destroyed all the other trees in its vicinity, with the exception of the fir tree. And because the fir tree remained, Boniface actually referred to it as the fir tree was actually the tree of the Christ child. And the other reason why Boniface also took this view, that because this tree survived while all the other trees were crushed by the oak of Geismar, he also noticed the triangular shape of the Christmas tree, and he saw the triangular shape of the Christmas tree as a fitting illustration of the Holy Trinity. And so, folks, we need to realize that there's nothing pagan here about the Christmas tree. As you could see, the ancient pagans did not adore, worship, venerate the fir tree, the tree that we know today as the Christmas tree. The Christmas tree was brought in through a Christian evangelist, and it was brought in not because it was worship, not because it was a pagan thing. It was brought in as a symbol of the power of God, and it was associated with the Trinity because of its triangular shape. And then later on in Germany, Martin Luther would later bring that tree into the home, into the church, and he used it for, again, symbolic purposes. And again, nothing pagan about that at all. And so, folks, I hope this video has been helpful to you. I hope it has shown you that things are not always as they seem. You need to check your sources. You need to be aware of history. And so if you have a Christmas tree in the home, you're not committed to paganism. You're not worshiping a foreign god. You're simply taking something that is part of God's creation. We adorn our homes with flowers. We adorn our homes with plants. That certainly doesn't mean that if you bring roses into the home, you're worshiping the rose. And this certainly doesn't mean that if you're bringing a bouquet of spring flowers, you're worshiping the spring goddess. And so we need to put these things into perspective. The tree, the Christmas tree, has become symbolic, not only of the hardiness, the durability of Christ and the light of Christ and so forth, but also its triangular shape, again, has become a famous symbol of the Trinity. So if you have a Christmas tree in the home, God bless you. If you don't, God bless you. This is a gray area. You don't have to if you don't want to. And again, everyone needs to follow their conscience, as Paul tells us in Romans 14, 1 to 8. So